Welcome everybody to today's webinar, New Year, New Normal, Employment Trends and Predictions for 2022. Today's webinar is sponsored by Embroker Business Insurance and produced and brought to you by Above the Law. My name is Bob Ambrogi. I am a columnist for Above the Law. I also write my own blog, law sites on legal technology and innovation, and have a podcast on legal technology and innovation called Law Next. And we're going to get to introducing our panelists in just a moment. We have a great panel here. I just want to mention a couple of things in terms of housekeeping, which is we have a Q&A interface down in the lower left part of your screen. And we're going to leave time, of course, at the end of the program for your questions and answers. But if you have a question that's really pertinent to something that we're talking about at any given moment as we're going through the webinar, go ahead and drop it in there. I'll keep an eye on that Q&A panel throughout the webinar. And if there's something you want to raise, we'll take it up. Also, if you have a technical issue, the folks who host the platform will be keeping an eye on that, and you can drop a technical question in there and they'll help you with that. The recording of this webinar will be available to you even after we're done today at the same, using the same login that you used to get in here today. If you want the slides, we'll indicate later in the program how you can get a copy of the slides. The slides are pretty much just an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. There's not a lot of substance to them, but we certainly can make them available to you. So with that, as I say, we're going to be talking about the new normal. Everybody talks about the new normal these days, but we're going to talk about it in the specific context of the workplace and even more specifically in the context of the law office as workplace. And to help us do that today, we have three panelists who are all have expertise in this area to share with us. And I'm going to go around and have each of them introduce themselves rather than my go on at length introducing them on their behalf. So let me just start with Howard Lavin. Welcome to the panel. Howard, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Howard Lavin. I'm the chair of the Employment Law Group at Stroock. We represent employers in all facets of labor and employment law across various industries throughout the U.S.
Thanks, Howard. And next up, Alan Nochumson.
Hi, Alan Nochumson. I'm a shareholder at Nochumson P.C. I own a real estate law boutique firm in Center City, Philadelphia.
Thanks, Alan. And then finally, Corrie Hurm.
Thanks, Bob. I'm the head of claims here at Embroker, and we are provide business insurance to small companies, including some employment practices, liability insurance, which is part of what we're going to be talking about today. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. So just as we get started here, let me bring up a couple of slides that just offer a little bit of a snapshot of the workplace as it exists right now in 2022. And then before I do that, let me just go over what we're going to cover today. Our program today will cover kind of the new normal of permanent remote work. We'll take a look at that in depth, talk a little bit about some of the benefits of in-person versus remote versus hybrid situations, talk more about growing your firm, and in particular, growing your firm in the context of this new normal in which we find ourselves. And then finally, talk about building a positive workplace culture at this point in time. With regard to those kind of snapshot slides that I referred to, one is just a current state of employment litigation as it's happening at the EEOC, and the most frequent kinds of cases that are being brought there. And as you can see here, what's interesting is that the most common type of case being brought is a retaliation claim, then followed by disability, race, sex, age, national origin, color, religion. I think it's interesting that top category is retaliation claims. And then you look at the next slide we have, which is, as you've all heard, we are in the middle of this great resignation. And the trend has been of people quitting their jobs in record numbers. And exactly why that is, I'm not sure we know. But I'm curious, Howard, since you do employment law, just when you look at these two slides and you think about the numbers of retaliation claims that people are bringing, the numbers of people who are leaving their jobs, does this tell you something about the state of the workplace in 2022?
I think I agree that it's interesting. Retaliation claims have long led the chart from the EEOC's annual submission on claims being filed. And it's not surprising because retaliation can attach to any form of claim that the person makes or opposition to unlawful discrimination. I am seeing an uptick in my practice in disability claims, which is consistent with that slide. Work from home, reasonable accommodation requests. The EEOC long has taken the position that remoting is a reasonable accommodation. And yet courts were not as hospitable to that theory. Obviously, it's fact specific, but courts were quite receptive to employers making a motion for summary judgment that being on site was an essential function of the job. And one of the interesting aspects of this for me is as we go forward, whether judges having themselves worked on a remote basis for at least part of the pandemic will be more receptive to these claims going forward.
That's really interesting. Well, let's talk more about this question of remote work. This year last year ended. This year kicked off with news of a major law firm, Quinn Emanuel, announcing that it's going to offer its lawyers the opportunity to work remotely indefinitely. They don't have to come into work at all if they don't want to. The one columnist who wrote about this development said, quote, "It's either brilliantly forward-thinking or gimmickry." I'm curious what the panelists think just in general about this announcement. We'll dive a little bit more into the question of remote work, but which is it? Is it a brilliant move by this firm or is it gimmickry? Corrie, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I don't know if it's necessarily a brilliant move, but it's definitely with the times right now. So after the past 2 years, for a lot of us, we have been forced to work from home, and attorneys have proven that they're able to do so, right? Whereas before there was some resistance to it, I think, in law firms that were really holding on to working in the traditional environments, even though attorneys might be out taking depositions, court appearances, meeting with clients. Really, the law firms were holding on to that, working in the office, billing your hours during office time. And we've all been forced into this environment and frankly proven that it can be successful. So firms like Quinn Emanuel are really just capturing on that. And I think that they'll be better off when looking for new talent in line with this great resignation, because it's really putting employees now in the driver's seat to dictate the terms of employment that they're looking for.
Yeah. Alan, you run a firm. You have a small firm in the Philadelphia area. How have you approached this issue of remote work?
Well, during the beginning of the pandemic, we did work almost exclusively remote, in a remote nature. And we kept, the teamwork together through, every morning we had a team meeting, a half an hour. We discussed what was happening during that day. We try to end it on an inspirational note by having a quote of a day, an inspirational quote. But eventually, I think, the time came where things had to open back up. Society wanted to open back up. So I understand that you want to be flexible, and we are. Right now, I'm sitting in the co-working space, where, I didn't think it was responsible for us to have our current physical location with the amount of people that we have on site. So we've kind of divided between our home site, our law firm, as well as a co-working space to give us, more room. But I think from a cultural standpoint and a training perspective, it's really important to have people there in person. And I don't really think you can overlook the importance of that, because ultimately every firm has a certain culture, and we want to have a way of doing things. And I think you need people like physically here a lot of times to make that happen.
Yeah. Howard, what's your situation at your firm, and what's your take on this efficacy of remote work versus needing to be in the office?
Well, what we're doing is we are currently hybrid. Actually, at this moment, coming into the office is optional, but we will go back to coming in 3 days a week on March 1st. We have a variety of lawyers who have been resident in one of our offices, whether New York, LA, Miami, or Washington, and they've said to us, look, I'm moving. And so yesterday I was on a call talking about someone who's moving to Maine. A couple weeks ago it was Ohio. And so there are certain issues that we need to address each time that comes up, but we are being flexible. And, to echo what Corrie said, I think that firms being flexible, I think is important, because you're looking to attract and retain top talent. You started when you referenced the Department of Labor statistics about the Great Resignation, but that's only one half of the coin. The other is that the Department of Labor also has statistics which show that employers are reporting record high job openings. And so employers are chasing talent. And I think employers are prudent to be open to things that historically we would have probably said, no, thanks. We've done it this way. It's worked. But as our panel has said, none of us could have predicted that law firms could have functioned well, even thrived in a remote environment almost 2 years into the pandemic.
Yeah, that pursuit of talent is something that gets talked about a lot. And in fact, I think Quinn Emanuel in its announcement talked about that very point in terms of wanting to enable opportunities for lawyers, regardless of where they're physically located, to be part of their firm. Corrie, what are your thoughts on that? How does this play into firms recruiting and retaining employees and lawyers?
Yeah, well, I've heard across the board, firms of all sizes and across the country and every state, firms are having a harder and harder time right now attracting talent, especially associates. I don't know so much on the lateral partner level, but definitely more younger level associates. Firms are having a really hard time just attracting resumes at all. So to the point that Howard was just making is that there is a lot of competition for talent out there right now with the firms, because I think that these employees are really in the driver's seat right now to kind of dictate the treatment. I interestingly read something also this week that companies in general, and I wonder if this applies to law firms, are kind of farther behind and still demanding more from the positions that they're posting and opening the scope of those positions, but still not offering competitive salaries, and some of them not offering competitive types of work arrangements, such as either hybrids like I think both Alan and Howard's firms are doing. Yeah.
Alan, what about you? I as I recall from a pre-webinar discussion we had, you've done some hiring over the last couple of years. How have you handled that, and how has the pandemic played into your process for that?
Yeah, so we have a 5-attorney firm. Pre-pandemic, we were only 2. I kept it small, and business actually skyrocketed. I'm in real estate, did not think that was going to happen. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of firms were scaling back while we were getting busier. So the first few months into the pandemic, I believe it was that summer, we started posting for a job. We had so many resumes from people, like we were just looking for someone 1 to 4 years out. We were getting people who were like 10 to 15 years out, literally begging for a job because a lot of people scaled back, the law firms scaled back. So the first time we looked for someone, it was easy. We had so many qualified applicants. Last summer, we also had a similar type of associate position open, and it really was tough. There weren't as many applicants. When I sought that other associate, I'm like, oh my God, we're going to get so many applicants. And I think things changed. I think that firms realized that they could work through the pandemic, and some of them hired back individuals, and other people found jobs that they may have, lost at the beginning of the pandemic. So it was really tough. So this summer was a lot tougher. So I think I would echo what the other panelists stated, that it's harder to find talent now. And there could be many reasons, but it's definitely harder to find talent from experience.
Yeah. And is it harder to not just find, but then evaluate or attract them, given the options available to them?
Well, like I said, I think we are more into being in person with the flexibility of having a remote environment. So I think that's why I do like to have people here, because I think that's an easier way to evaluate. On the flip side, when we were exclusively remote, our team did a great job. I was really proud of the fact that they were able to work from home and they were very productive. So, but I think it's easier to evaluate when they're in front of you than, in a remote environment. Yeah.
Howard, obviously you work in a firm that confronts a lot of these issues, and then you practice in an area in which you counsel others around these issues. What are you having to counsel your clients on regarding the risks to their businesses or to their workplace policies of working remotely?
I think that when you look at this, I think that you can separate law firms from other businesses, because law firms have the unique aspect of lawyers needing to be authorized to practice law. And so when we get a request from someone, as I mentioned earlier, who is moving outside of New York, the first thing that we do is we look at the rules on the unauthorized practice of law in the jurisdiction where the person is moving. And that varies in each state. And so that's a concern to us as a firm, and it's also a concern to the individual. And then the next issue that we look at, in fact, it's a team of us, and we divvy up who addresses these issues. And again, this is a concern both to the firm and the individual, and that's paying state and local income tax. There are different obligations in different jurisdictions. As a firm, we may now have to register to do business and pay tax on the profit that we earn because someone's working in a jurisdiction. There are various statutory issues that you need to address. For example, workers' compensation is done on a state-by-state basis. Some states require that if you have just one employee in that jurisdiction that you obtain workers' comp. So you need to look at whether it's workers' comp, paid family leave, vacation. Whether it's structured as vacation or PTO, it's again governed by state law, and California is different than New York. And things like remote workplace expenses, again, that varies. For staff, I would say the biggest issue is wage and hour compliance, making sure that people sign in at the start of the day, sign out at the end, sign in and out for lunch, and also take breaks as prescribed by state law.
What about some of the issues that are harder to monitor, such as perhaps harassment or issues around discrimination? Are remote environments riskier or less risky for those kinds of employment concerns?
I would argue that they're both. On the one hand, harassment can be unwelcome conduct that's physical or verbal. You can have physical harassment in a remote environment. On the other hand, you certainly can have verbal harassment, and quite frankly, it's in some respects more likely to happen because you're speaking to someone through email, text messages. With that medium, you can hear tone. You can hear tone now. I would argue that when you're speaking to people in a room, one of the things that I know I can do is I can read the audience and see whether my message is resonating. If I'm saying something, I can hopefully see if I'm offending someone. But if I'm doing training to 25 people where my PowerPoint is in the middle of my screen and the attendees are on the side, it's really tough to read that room. And so I think that adds to harassment. With turnover and new people, I believe that you may have situations where people don't know me. They don't know my personality. They don't know my sense of humor. And so I think that that's also an added challenge that we have with so much turnover in the workforce generally.
Corrie, let me put the similar question to you in terms of what you see or what you're hearing in terms of what are some of the business risks that law firms or other employers face from this sort of hybrid or remote environment.
Sure. I mean, like you said, you would think that harassment and retaliation, discrimination claims would go down in the remote work environment. And they, in fact, have not. It's just like Howard said, that the way that they are happening has changed and morphed. And ironically, I almost feel that these types of claims are more often substantiated now in this remote work environment because, again, like Howard said, they're often in writing. So instead of allegations of saying this person maybe would say X, Y, and Z to me in the office when we would sit in meetings or have coffee or over lunch, now these things are communicated either via emails or text, Slack, or Skype. And so these things are documented then. Howard makes a good point too, that I think that it is a risk, especially for newer hires that companies or law firms might have, that people tend to feel very isolated being onboarded in a remote work environment. And all of those kind of organic interactions where you can really get to know people have dissipated. So it almost has to be more of a forced situation where companies really have to take mind to try and mitigate these risks by doing what they can in a remote environment, whether it's remote types of social engagements or force coffee meetings via Zoom to try and get to know people and make them feel included, and really be mindful of the blurred boundaries between home and work that people are dealing with, and that everyone has their unique situations that might prevent them from engaging, and be mindful and sensitive to that all these employees might have.
Yeah. Alan, just for you back into this, you've been in kind of both situations here. You had everybody working remotely for a period of time, and you've got people coming back into the office now. What I'm wondering is how did that differ in terms of the experience that your clients, and how has it, if at all, changed how you work with and what your clients experience in terms of working with the attorneys at your firm?
So in some ways, like, the pandemic has enhanced our experience with our clients. Pre-pandemic, I never heard of Zoom. I never did video conferencing. And you only have so much time in the day to physically meet with people. And I feel like, I'm over Zoomed and over video conference calls, but I really do think that gives that extra touch when you're seeing someone and talking to them rather than just an audio call. So we definitely leverage video conferencing as much as possible with clients. A lot of times, we have a pretty robust land use and zoning practice, so we have to meet in front of the community. We have to have like a ton of hearings in front of our zoning board. So we have to show presentations. So it's actually great working meetings with our clients because we're able to go through our presentation materials with our client, and visually it's very helpful to see their reaction to how what our presentation materials look like. And it helps us coach them, to be honest. When, we see someone who doesn't have their video on, we just caution them during the meeting, during the hearing, have your video on. Stay focused. Don't text, don't do 10 different things. So I think the experience is actually better with our clients more than anything. And it's actually helped my practice in the sense of I don't have to run to 1,000 community meetings. Like I can sit and I can go from one part of the city to the other part of the city in seconds. In some ways, though, it's given me an excuse not to meet with people. I don't know if that's good or bad. But we do really have a policy of trying not to physically meet with our clients in our office because we are trying to be careful in terms of COVID. So.
Yeah, you're going into an office, but as you say, you're in a co-working space. Do you think that sort of the traditional notion of a bricks and mortar law firm has changed, even for lawyers who need to meet face to face with clients or go in to meet with their staff or other lawyers? Does it matter as much where that meeting is happening?
No, I don't. And, it's actually doing this co-working space. We were thinking about expanding our space. We've been expanding the amount of attorneys and, I'm in my late 40s. I want to have a grown-up space, as one of my last spaces, really nice to match my practice. And it's definitely doing this co-working space has definitely had me look at, what's important. I'm not one to sit at a desk. If I'm in the co-working space, I have my feet on the couch, with my laptop on. I don't know if, I think, and, I defer to the panelists who, work at, bigger companies than me, but I think the way that law firms are going to act going forward, it's going to be completely different. I don't think everyone's going to have an office. I don't think everyone needs an office. And I don't think everyone needs the space that they previously had. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see, hopefully in the next year we're out of the pandemic, to see how law firm practice progresses overall.
Yeah. Howard or Corrie, do you have any thoughts on that? Howard, I'm kind of wondering, one of the things I wondered a lot about is I know from a business development point for some law firms, it's often significant to them, or feels significant to them, the address that they have, whether they are, are you a New York firm? Where in New York are you? Are you a DC firm? Does that kind of stuff matter as much anymore?
It's hard to say. I would argue that from the standpoint of onboarding people, of pitching business, I think that there's nothing that substitutes for face-to-face contact, particularly if you're bringing on an equity partner to a firm. You want to get the measure of that person. And I think you do that best in an in-person interaction. And so I think that whether it's onboarding, training, collegiality, the culture of the firm, I think that those become challenges in a remote environment. I would argue that for firms that pre-pandemic, when you needed to have space, that being able to work remote so it's acceptable is arguably the removal of a barrier to entry to the point that, that you were making. I think that it is easier for people, and what will be interesting in my mind is whether or not this is the new normal now, but as we transition from pandemic to endemic, whether or not we'll see a return to to some extent to on-site, so that perhaps having the presence, having that address will become more important again. And to some degree, that'll be dictated by our clients.
I appreciate your optimism that we're going to transition at some point. Let's hope that happens. Corrie, what are your thoughts on that? What's the future of the bricks and mortar office? And does it matter as much where that office is or who's in it and who's not in it?
Yeah, Howard just made a good point that I was thinking about, that I think a lot of it will be dictated by the clients. I think that the law firms at some point, a lot of large ones especially, might go back to some sort of brick and mortar offices in some capacity, like Howard's saying that they will be in a hybrid work environment. And I think a lot of them will be in a hybrid work environment sustainably going forward. So some space will be needed. But I think the importance of, say, having a Wall Street firm, right? Well, and those types of things will be dictated by the clients going forward. And I have a suspicion that those types of things aren't going to matter to the clients so much. I think that clients have gotten comfortable doing video conferencing or meeting in more casual places and really having this more flexible lifestyle. And it's more about the work product and what they're getting from their attorneys than kind of what they're seeing on the outside. So I agree with Howard that it's going to be dictated by them. My sense is that it's going to move away from that of somewhat.
There was actually a question from somebody in the audience on, we've been talking a lot about the possible benefits or downsides of working remotely versus working in the office. And there's a question as to whether any of the speakers know of any quantitative data to support the differences between in-person and remote work in terms of revenue, client retention, employee retention. Does anybody know? Is there any data out there? Do we know for sure what works and what doesn't work?
I guess, Bob, I'm sorry.
No, you go. I'm sorry.
The only thing I would point to in terms of data would be the Department of Labor statistics that show that whether it's 4.4 or 4.5 million people resigning in a month, that's just astounding. That's an astounding number. And some of it, when you look at the industries, are because they're customer-facing individuals. The Omicron variant, or before that, the Delta variant became a challenge. And so I think that added to it. But whether or not people are resigning because being in a remote environment, it has the promise, the potential to provide greater flexibility and work-life balance, which everybody is telling us they want. But if you don't use it correctly, then, for example, in New York, if someone is living in a suburban area and they have an hour commute each way, they have 2 hours more that they've picked up each day. How are they using that time? Are they using that time exclusively for billing? Or does it provide them with greater flexibility? And because if the firm is simply viewing it as, hey, I can get 2 more billable hours, at some point, it's not just doing it at the crush of the closing or as you prep for trial, but when that becomes every day, then I think it becomes overwhelming, and the remote work environment actually exacerbates issues that people have and may contribute to them resigning.
Mm-hmm. Alan, you started to say something there. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think it's too early to really understand the effect of remote working and productivity. I will say this, just thinking about it, this pandemic has definitely changed the way we think of life in general. When someone faces death, I'm sure that they look back or they're thinking about, like, what if I'm doing something, is this something I want to do? I guess it's a forced midlife crisis for a lot of people. And I think partly the reason people are resigning is they realize life's short. I'm not happy what I'm doing, and I'm going to revisit the situation. Honestly, I think that's what's happening a lot with a lot of people. out there.
Yeah. Is there a flip side of that for some people, in the sense that I know that there's been a lot of there. One place there has been a lot of data is that law firms have traditionally had difficulty retaining women, people of color, and often because of the inability to maintain work-life balance, working in a big firm and commuting to a big firm, and that for some people, the opportunity to work remotely and virtually, in fact, enhances their ability to stay with a firm and continue to work with a firm, because they don't have to deal with all those kinds of challenges. Do any of the panelists have any thoughts on that issue of whether virtual working can help, in fact, promote diversity and opportunities within a law firm?
So, Bob, I think that it can, and it has the potential to, but the data right now is that it is not right. The data is borne out that it's actually women and minorities that are leaving the workforce in droves as a result of the pandemic and all the consequences of it, due to childcare and other things of that nature. So I think that it's possible, but I think that it is very reliant on the company or the law firm, whoever the employer is, to really support those individuals in that environment. And I think that the blurring of boundaries makes it really impossible for some people. And Howard was just speaking to this, about the extra hours of the day and what are you doing with them, and are you billing them, and when are they being billed? And if there is just an assumption that those extra hours in the day that you might not spend on the trainer being spent working, I don't think it's going to be sustainable to increase having women and people in diverse work environments at law firms. I really think that the law firms are going to have to be supportive of those blurred boundaries and really being sensitive to people's needs. And if they do that, it can be successful in expanding workforces in terms of having more female partners, associates, and more diverse workforces in law firms.
I think that Corrie is spot on there. I think that you need to become a better listener and understand that communication is critical. And so, as we see many firms now looking at hybrid arrangements where they'll be in the office 3 days a week, you need to know who's going to be in when. And so each firm and department will deal with that, some on an institutional basis, some on a department by department basis. But when it comes to individuals, you need to let your team know that it's okay to deal with whether it's a child care issue, whether it's self-care, whether it's a doctor's appointment. Just give me a heads up that you're not going to be available and we'll work around it. So communication is critical. And sometimes that means managing expectations of our clients. Because I can tell you at the start of the pandemic, I would roll out of bed, get coffee, and start working. And then once I became fully vaccinated, I went back to the gym in the morning, and I felt so much better. And so I got back a degree of my normal routine, and it improved my outlook 100%. And that's me. If you are a working parent and you're dealing with childcare issues with Zoom school, I mean, oh my God, that is incredibly challenging. And so as an employer, as a supervisor, you need to be mindful and supportive of your folks. You have to get the product out, but you need to understand that if you don't listen to your employees, they're going to show their displeasure with their feet and they will leave.
We've talked already in this conversation about how firms can grow in this current environment. Alan, you talked a little bit about your experience in that regard, but I wonder if you have any other thoughts to add on this topic of what a firm needs to consider to grow and expand in the environment in which we find ourselves today.
Yeah, I mean, we've always been an outside-the-box law firm where we've actually prided ourselves to be forward-thinking. And even then, it's been challenging during the pandemic. I do think flexibility is very important. I had a conversation with a recruiter today. We're looking to hire someone a little more senior for our corporate practice. And the conversation was, do we want someone, who's like 5 or 10 years out, who is a rising superstar? Or would we want someone who's like looking to downsize, essentially, their legal career, where it's not the end all be all, but they're really good at what they do. And, but flexibility is always, in the forefront of our, of what we need to do in both situations. I think it's good for some people to be flexible. I think one of the panelists stated it's tough though too. You have to create boundaries for oneself because it's just like the cell phones, right? I've been practicing law for 20 years. I think at the beginning of my career, cell phones were being used, but now we're like it's a ball and chain. So you have the cell phones. Now you're in my house at all times. Like, where are the boundaries? And it's difficult for some people to create those boundaries for oneself, to protect oneself. So that's something to just think about.
Yeah, well, it plays right into what was the next topic we're going to talk about, probably, which is building a positive workplace culture and maintaining a positive workplace culture. Corrie, could I ask you what you see as the importance of workplace culture or the challenges of maintaining a positive workplace culture in this current environment?
Yeah, again, I think I'd reiterate, it's still respecting folks' boundaries, and Alan was just touching on that as well, and Howard, and folks have childcare issues, need to bring their kids to school for an hour in the morning, or want to go to the gym for themselves, to respect those boundaries. And, as communication, again, like Howard said, is key, and to do those things so you can continue to have employees that have good morale and that are motivated to work, or else they're not going to have the motivation. And again, it's really an employee's market right now. So there's a lot of motivation for employees to frankly look for something better if they're not in a workplace environment that's going to support their needs.
It's funny, we had a comment early in the program from somebody who said that this firm culture argument falls on deaf ears because frequently the pre-COVID culture was toxic. Is this one of those situations where we're remembering the good old days, only the good old days weren't what we remember them to be?
Almost, I feel like the pandemic has forced law firms, maybe more so than most other industries, to really move the needle. Because I don't disagree with that. Law firms always had the reputation of having kind of these toxic workplace, FaceTime environments. And the circumstances of the pandemic has forced them to move the needle. So specifically, if they want to maintain and attract and keep talent.
Yeah. Howard, do you have any comments on this, on the question of building and maintaining a positive workplace culture in this environment?
Yeah, look, I think that firms have values, core values, and I think that a good exercise is to create a mission statement, but that's the first step. After you create that mission statement, then you have to live it. Senior leadership has to model the behavior. People who participate and are reinforcing those core values need to be rewarded. So when you're talking about, for example, providing positive and constructive criticism, career development, taking an interest in someone's future, training, those are the kinds of things that we should be encouraging and we should reward people for doing. I think that that's part of it. I think it's taking the proverbial open door policy that we had when we were all in brick and mortar offices, and now having the equivalent of feeling comfortable enough with people so that you can have interactions at all levels. Because if someone is comfortable with me, with somebody else in a leadership role, then they're going to bring their issues of concern, whether it's discrimination, harassment, or whether something should be a reimbursable expense. They'll bring that to someone's attention so that the issue can be examined and addressed. Whether it is resolved as they want or not, at least someone will be listening. And I think that that's critical.
Corrie, you work at Embroker, which is an insurance company. Are there particular insurance or insurable issues that arise during the pandemic, or even in the post-pandemic era, that employers should be thinking about, particularly law firm employers?
Sure. So it kind of circles back to what we were all talking about at the beginning of the hour about claims that are brought by employees and what we see. And I think that Howard had mentioned that retaliation's always been at the top of the list for the past several years with the EEOC, and with the pandemic, all these type of claims have just been highlighted. The details and the factual allegations tend to have changed a little bit. A lot of claims that we see from the employment space regarding employees seeking some sort of accommodations for disabilities. And again, these things are highlighted and brought into focus with concerns about the pandemic, people staying healthy, protecting themselves as well as folks in their home. And we see a lot of employment claims stemming from that.
I wanted to get to the question. We have several questions here, and we're only got about 13 minutes left in the program. And if anybody else has questions, be sure to put them in there. But Howard, this might be an appropriate question for you in terms of the trends regarding, well, the question is, what are the trends regarding expanding workforces beyond state boundaries and requiring in-person meetings a few times a year at the main office, which may be in another state or several hundred miles away? So with regard to travel policies and stipends, I mean, you talked earlier, Howard, about ensuring that lawyers are properly licensed and that you're complying with the ethics rules of a particular state in which a lawyer may be working remotely. But what about these issues about how does this play into travel policies and reimbursements and other expenses?
Well, look, I think that to answer the question, I do think that there are firms and companies more broadly that are hiring across state lines, because most of the job can be done on a remote basis. And so when you're looking for talent and the talent's not in your geographic area, you're going to expand. I mean, that's just a given. Now, when you bring those people on board, sometimes there are legal requirements that you need to be mindful of. There are a handful of jurisdictions like California, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C. that have requirements that employers reimburse employees for necessary expenses that are incurred on behalf of the employer to do the job. The statute in Washington, D.C. speaks of tools, which obviously in our context, it's not a hammer, but clearly that has been interpreted to require reimbursement. Now, there's an interesting aspect of it. If someone chooses to live in a different jurisdiction, is it necessary? So there's an argument that it might not be covered, even in California, where there's a well-defined body of case law. But then from an economic standpoint, I'm an employer. I want to retain and attract people. So maybe what I will do as part of my remote employee policy is I'm going to say, look, we want you to come to the home office twice a year, and we will reimburse you for that expense, because it's a quantifiable expense that we can incur, and that will be important in integrating you into our business and culture.
Fascinating. It must be some fascinating workers' comp issues coming up as well, in terms of when somebody's on the job or not.
Absolutely, because it's not a space that the employer controls.
Right. Another question asked about the challenges integrating people working remotely when others are working on premises. The questioner says it's easy to have an out of sight, out of mind situation. How can or should that be managed to avoid the inequity and integration issues? Corrie or Alan, do either of you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. So because of the amount of attorneys we've taken on during the pandemic, we have spatial limitations. That's another reason why we got the co-working space. One of the attorneys works exclusively in the co-working space. So I make a point of it to make sure I'm here. Some people prefer our current office space, but I treat others how I like to be treated. And I know I would feel like I'm on an island if I was by myself. And then I would also question, well, why am I going to the co-working space and doing that hour commute each way, like Howard stated, if all I'm going to be doing is sitting in a separate space, not integrated with the team? So I really do try to make a point of it to be available physically to everyone. It is tougher when people are remote, but you try to make time. And I think that's when you use you use Zoom or Teams or Google Meetup to like physically see someone or visually see someone. So to try to take that extra step than just a phone call.
Yeah. I wonder about the pressure that this may put, maybe even in bigger firms, on younger associates. I have a family friend who's a woman who recently had a baby, who's a second-year associate at a big firm, who feels very much pressure to go in the office, even though many of the senior lawyers aren't going into the office. And it is this sort of, out of sight, out of mind kind of a fear. There's not an express requirement that she be in the office, but there is this sort of unspoken feeling that it's something she should be doing. And I don't know how that plays out. But, anybody else have thoughts on that question, that out of sight, out of mind issue?
I think, Bob, you really need to work at it. It's especially hard for first-year associates who they're new to a firm. Maybe they've summered with the firm, but they're starting their career. And one of the ways that people would meet is at the coffee bar, at the elevator. They would see people. Corrie used the word before, organically, and it's so true. It captures something that makes it tougher for those people so that they are top of mind, or at least in the group of individuals that the assigning attorney is thinking about. Because what lawyers want a steady stream of quality work. If they don't get enough work, oh my God, I have nothing to do, I'm going to be fired. If I have too much work, I'm overburdened, it's 24/7. So in that sense, being mindful of who you're assigning the work to, ensuring that people are getting work, making sure that even though you haven't met someone face to face, that you're trying. You have to be purposeful and mindful about this, and it's really hard. Alan mentioned before having daily conferences, video conferences, and ending with an inspirational a quote. You need to do something, and that's one way to require people to have that connection.
Yeah, and I guess that also spills over. We've touched on this several times during this panel, on this question of training and ensuring quality control and growth, particularly for new associates. any other suggestions or tips around that training issue? I mean, it's funny. One of the things I've heard, I've heard some people lament that younger lawyers aren't getting the mentoring that they would have gotten in a physical office or being live in a physical office. And yet I've also heard others say they're getting more FaceTime with the senior partners and the lawyers at their firm, even if it's on Zoom. So, Corrie, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, I think it's an issue that's always plagued law firms because like Howard just said, that lawyers are worried about attracting and retaining clients and then completing the work. And lawyers didn't go to law school and learn how to become managers and supervisors, and you have to figure it out along the way if you want to bring up young associates. And I think it's always plagued law firms that they haven't had enough time to really dedicate to training young associates. So I think it's probably something that went to before the pandemic. And Bob, I've been hearing similar things, that it's a real challenge for young associates, some with training, and some feel like they're getting more exposure, that they can sit in on depositions and trials and things and do them remotely, and it's saving a lot of time, and they can learn things more easily that way.
Yeah. We do have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure we have an opportunity to kind of just go around and let each panelist kind of share your final thoughts, your final words of advice, your final takeaways before we wrap up here today. So why don't we do that? Let's go around and Howard, since we started with you at the beginning, why don't we start with you again in terms of your final thoughts on this?
I think that employers in general and law firms in particular need to look at remoting as an opportunity. And whether it's an opportunity to bring on additional talent, and or to service their existing and hopefully additional clients in a way that they haven't in the past. But if they're not smart about it, if they're not mindful, then to the point Corrie made before about the disproportionate number of lawyers of color and female lawyers that are resigning, then you miss that opportunity, and remote work becomes something that is not helpful. And so there's potential, there's opportunity, but you need to work at it and communicate in order to make it successful for your firm.
Thanks, Howard. Alan, how about you?
What Howard said, ditto. I mean, basically, I think Howard said it great. I mean, it's an opportunity, but it's also something to take very seriously and to look at carefully as well, because I think creating those boundaries is really important for the mental health of your workforce.
Sounds good. And Corrie, your closing thoughts.
Thanks. So from an insurance perspective, all these things that we're talking about are potential risks and landmines with employing a workforce of any nature, right? So it's something for lawyers to think about in terms of insurability and do they have the appropriate insurance to protect their business, frankly. I think a lot of times, especially small law firms that are just starting out, are so hyper-focused on client growth. They're not thinking about how to protect their business and their assets and how to do it through insurance. And obviously there's employment practices, liability insurance that's available. And I think about it from that perspective to protect your business from the type of landmines that we're talking about here with employing a workforce.
Well said. Well, thanks again to our panelists, Howard Lavin of Stroock, Alan Nochumson of his own firm, Nochumson P.C., and Corrie Hurm, head of claims at Embroker. Thanks to Embroker for sponsoring today's program. Thanks to Above the Law for pulling it all together and producing it. And thanks to everybody in the audience for participating. Really appreciate your attending That does it for today's webinar. Thanks for watching.